Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our next seminar in this year's seminar series as a part of the Expeditions project. Today we have Jeff Townsend, who is going to speak about optimal quarantining and testing. I don't need to introduce Jeff again. We had an excellent talk by him last year, and I'll just summarize by saying that I really have enjoyed the work he's done and his presentation. So Jeff, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much for the introduction and the opportunity to present some of the work that I've been recently doing. It occurred to me that just as I was starting up for this presentation, that I don't have the typical acknowledgement slide saying who else I did this work with. So I'm just going to start by on the cover slides mentioning all the people this was done with. This is work which I started, I guess, at about 6 months ago with some pretty intense effort, and got basically most of the sort of the mathematics and the theory all done and some of the basic computation. And then I was like just feeling overwhelmed because I'm a PI and I have 10,000 different projects to do, and doing things yourself is difficult. So then I was fortunate to have Chad Wells, who's a research scientist, work with me to finish it off and like basically, do all the coding of it so that it actually executed quickly and easily and expand on it in a couple directions. And so Chad and I are maybe primarily responsible for this work. In addition, there were a number of other people who really helped guide it, initially in terms of framing it, helping put the literature together so that we could do this, because a lot of it was deciding between different data sets that argue different things, et cetera, and things like that. And so I really value all the contributions my senior colleagues and others contributed to this. So those other people are Abhishek Pandey, Alison Gavani, Syed Mogadas, Bert Singer, Gary Krieger, and this guy, Rob McDonald, who actually works for BHP. You'll see that we have some data from the BHP Corporation, which is an oil and gas industry corporation, where they did some quarantine and testing, and we have actual data from what they did integrated into the work. That's because they got involved, they got in touch with us early on because they were very concerned about these questions, and I'll address why they were so concerned later in the talk. So thanks very much to all of my collaborators who contributed to this. I was very happy to do it. It was really interesting for me because it was sort of just, de novo modeling from my standpoint, not using a bunch of techniques other people had done, but saying like, how do we solve this problem using math and computation? And so I'm not going to get into the methods too much, but I would welcome any question, any point about the methods side of this. I just don't have slides, a setup of slides on the methods so much. You'll see some methodological graphical description, but I mean, in terms of intricate methods, feel free to ask me. I'm happy to expand on it. The long and the short, it was really interesting for that reason. And then when the work came out, we got a lot of attention from the media because, of course, people were actively thinking about how much to quarantine. This work first came out on bioRxiv right before the Thanksgiving, when people were thinking about how to safely visit their family, and then was still under consideration right before Christmas, where it was also a major issue, and then it actually came out in Nature Communications just about 2 weeks ago, the actual paper. So the timing of it led to quite a lot of attention to the article, including attention from the CDC. So the first thing I want to just mention is that back in December 2nd, which was half a month or a little more than that, after we put our results out on bioRxiv, the CDC released options to reduce quarantine for contacts of persons with SARS-CoV-2 using symptom monitoring and diagnostic testing. And I don't necessarily need to probably go through this in detail with everyone, but they basically said maybe you can just go 10 days without testing, or if you do a test on the 7th day, maybe you can do that test. And the point that I just want to make is that they cited 3 sources for that result, and those sources are this Quilty and Clifford paper, which was very similar to what we did, but they used simulation modeling based on individuals in a latent period and an infectious period, et cetera, whereas what we used was a more analytical approach, more of a numerical solution to analytical equations approach to the optimal timing of quarantine and testing. So they came up with very similar results to what we came up with. Again, generally saying that the 14-day quarantine, which had been put out as what we should do for COVID-19, the risk reduction for post-quarantine transmission by looking at 7 days of quarantine with a test at the end. So that is sort of where we were. And our paper came out, and then they did some of their own modeling at the CDC as well to determine what the potential benefits of antigen testing or RT-PCR testing would be if you had a quarantine of a shorter period. So what's the motivation behind all this? I sort of skipped past that. The motivation behind this is it's actually really difficult for many people to do a quarantine of 2 weeks. If you are working a essential job kind of job, it's very common that employers won't permit you to take 2 weeks off. Your job may be at risk, your livelihood may be at risk, your income for 2 weeks may indeed be essential. The number of people who are in that position is the crowd we're talking to here is not subject to that, but there are a lot of people in America who really depend on their income on a regular basis and can't take 2 weeks off. And so is there any way to shorten the quarantine? That's sort of the general populace view. The other point is that for industry and for institutions who are trying to find out ways that they can interact with other people in a safe way, they want to sort of minimize the amount of time they have to put people into quarantine so that they can get to do the work that they're intended to do. And in particular, early on in this work, we started talking with the BHP Corporation, which is an oil and gas company based in Australia, about this because in the oil and gas industry, they have very, very specific concerns about individuals spreading contagion on the platforms and rigs they have out at sea. Those are very close quarters. It's very easy to transmit disease, especially airborne disease in those quarters. And if they have an outbreak happening there, they would have to depopulate the rig or the platform, and that depopulation would cost them billions of dollars. It's an incredibly expensive proposition because each rig or platform brings a lot of oil up, and they basically lose all of that oil for that entire period if they do it. So the cost to them of having an individual come down with COVID-19 on the platform, if they transmit and lead to an outbreak, is very, very high. And so they were really interested in figuring out ways to prevent that from happening, to prevent enormous economic losses on their behalf. Okay, so that's sort of the setup. And I'm just going to, again, start with like the big picture. The big picture is that we had two findings in our paper that are consistent with the CDC decision-making, which is that as a rule of thumb, and I'll go into why I'm saying rule of thumb rather than a rule exactly, because it is just a rule of thumb. But as a rule of thumb, the later the negative test you get in a quarantine, the more effective you prevent post-quarantine transmission. So generally speaking, you want to delay that test as long as you can, as long as you get the result before you potentially give exposure to whatever the risk group you're concerned about, whether it be your aunt and uncle when you go to visit them on a holiday, or when you go to visit your parents, or whatever it is that your concern is. You probably want to get that test as late as possible so that you get the results still before you actually visit them. The second major point is that shorter quarantines can be equally or indeed more effective than a 14-day quarantine, providing that you get a test 1 week into quarantine. So as long as you do that test at around 7 days, it's probably going to be more effective of a quarantine. Of course, the longer the quarantine is, the better, but if you have a test at 7 days, it's going to be more effective than this 2-week quarantine, no matter how long you make it, more than 7 days. So that should, in making decision-making, sort of rule of thumb-wise, pretty clearly. So let's talk a little bit more about what we did, though, how to get that result, and dive into the data so I can persuade you, hopefully, that or at least assess whether you believe what I have to say about it. So generally speaking, we had to develop some methodology to do this. In general, what we used, the two major sources of data that we used were timed transmission pair data that quantify the infectiousness across the COVID-19 disease time course. And a lot of the work of doing this in terms of coming up with a sort of mathematical framework was trying to make sure that our times were all aligned, right? Because there's data sets that say, after infection, here's the sensitivity of RT-PCR test. And then here's another thing that says there's 8 days before you get symptoms. And then another thing that says you're infectious, especially 3 days before you, from 3 days up to the time symptom appearance occurs. And so you have to sort of line these all up time-wise. So we quantified that infectiousness across the COVID-19 disease time course. And of course, for quarantine, what we really need is infectiousness and sensitivity from the time of infection, which is very different from something around the time of symptom onset, because then the incubation period is critically important. So a little bit of complexity had to be dealt with there. So that one data is this infectiousness across the COVID-19 disease time course. Another piece of data that was important was the sensitivity of the RT-PCR test across post-symptomatic COVID-19 disease time course. When we started this work, and up until very, very recently, a couple weeks ago, basically there was only data really post-symptomatic on whether the RT-PCR test was, how sensitive the RT-PCR test was. And so the problem is that most of the transmission is pre-symptomatic, as I'll show you later in the talk. And so what really is information about the RT-PCR validity pre-symptomatically rather than post-symptomatically. And so we had to do a trick to solve that, which I'll describe in detail here. So we wanted to determine how much infection is prevented by then quarantine and testing, given we know that this is how much infectiousness there is over the disease time course, and we know how much sensitivity there is RT-PCR test to like take someone out and say, oh, we've got to put them into case isolation because they're infectious, and therefore we're not going to get any transmission from them. So combining that RT-PCR data and the infectivity data and knowing how much more transmission is left when they leave quarantine, we can figure out what the risk of post-quarantine transmission is, and therefore quantify what the optimal testing and quarantine regime might be. So let's go through these methods piece by piece here. So to use this time transmission pair data, there's not a whole lot of methods here because we basically use data from another study, but we want to quantify the infectiousness across the COVID-19 disease time course. And this is the data that we used. It's data by Hay et al. And we looked at an analysis of the transmission pair data here. This is just the fit of the curve using the methods of Hay et al., so not our own methods. But then we added something which is our own estimate of the incubation period, because when Hay et al. Did it, they just looked at it again with respect to symptom onset, which doesn't help us with regard to a quarantine because we need to worry about when they were actually infected and what the time course of their full infection is with regard to quarantine. So using this other estimate of 8.29 days, and I can go into we'll go into some uncertainty analysis kind of thing about that in a little bit, and that transmission pair data gives us a curve that looks like this, where the black curve is the curve if you do not isolate when you are symptomatic, and the yellow curve is a curve that is what we'd estimate if you do isolate as soon as you're symptomatic, with the exception of individuals who are asymptomatic during their entire disease time course, and that's what's represented by the curve down here, individuals who continue to transmit but don't even realize they have an infection necessarily. So the main point that I want to make from this slide is that, as you can see, a lot of the transmission is occurring before symptom onset. So all of the methods that we have been using and should continue to use to try to, forestall COVID-19 transmission by monitoring for fevers or checking whether people have felt symptoms or something. We got to keep doing that, but we have to be very, very honest with ourselves that that is not something that will hold this disease in check. Even when you have perfect self-isolation of individuals who are symptomatic, that only reduces the R0 from about 2.5 to about 1.6, and R0 of 1.6 is a very fast spreading disease. So we can't do that alone. Of course, our other measures may also help to hold this disease down, mask wearing, hand washing, etc. But ultimately, symptom onset is not enough of a thing. And what we really need to do is forestall the kinds of transmission that is happening earlier on before symptom onset. This pre-symptomatic transmission is really key to stopping this epidemic. And the way to do that is to do testing on asymptomatic cases, not just symptomatic cases, and using other preventative methods such as the vaccines that are rolling out now. So that's just a general picture of that. And this transmission pair data plus this incubation point estimate gives us a curve for what the transmission is across the days of infection. And that allows us to then, place quarantines on this time course and see what the relative prevention of infection is by the imposition of quarantine. So secondly, in order to understand the effect of testing, how likely it is that a test will come out positive given where the person is in their time course. And I would emphasize that basically anytime you look at analyses of RT-PCR or this kind of testing, positive, negative, I think one of the things that we have not managed to public health message very clearly, and it's a difficult concept, so I understand why, is the fact that there's not a sensitivity of this RT-PCR test or of the antigen test either. It's not like, oh, well, it has a 75% chance of telling if you're sick. That's just the wrong message to send because it depends on where you are in the disease time course. When you first get infected, the probability is about 0%. And then it goes up to somewhere between 75 and 90% at symptom onset, and then it diminishes again later. And so giving any kind of fixed point estimate of how likely it is to detect disease is generally going to give inaccurate portrayals of what the test tells you about disease. It's going to make you feel like, well, if I take 2 tests, maybe that'll work. The thing you need to do is very different when you have something that varies over time, as opposed to something that has a fixed chance of detecting something over time. And I think we really need to do all we can to communicate to people that distinction. So the point is that at the time that I did this research, we had only data on the post-symptomatic sensitivity of RT-PCR studies. And you can see that there's declining sensitivity from symptom onset as the disease proceeds. And that's because your viral load actually tends to decline once your immune system really starts responding and you start getting sick. And so for that reason, the RT-PCR test, you just may not sample any virus when you do a swab or saliva test as things go on. And so the test is less sensitive later on. And so we have that pretty well parameterized from this data. Unfortunately, what we really need to know, as I mentioned before, is what is the RT-PCR sensitivity in this earlier period, 2 or 3 days before symptom onset would appear in the regular disease time course. And so how can we figure out that RT-PCR sensitivity? Well, the trick that I decided to use that in the end has worked out pretty well was to figure that out by taking this information about the post-symptomatic RT-PCR test sensitivity and relate it to that infectiousness curve. So presuming that the infectiousness curve corresponds to a viral load, and that makes sense since the RT-PCR is basically detecting whether it can find the RNA of the virus, then you can come up with an interpolation function, this S of V function here, that relates what the infectiousness curve is to what the sensitivity of the RT-PCR test is. And so if we presume that that relationship is true not just for post-symptomatic times, but also for symptomatic times, then we can basically use that same function S of V to figure out what, based on the infection curve, which is this blue line over here, what the RT-PCR sensitivity is pre-symptomatically. So what we do is we figure out that S of V, and that's right here. So here, again, the axis is different here. This is viral shedding on the x-axis, not time, whereas it's time in almost every other plot I'm going to show you here. But if we look at viral shedding, you can predict what the test sensitivity is. And this is all on the basis of the post-symptomatic data. But then that same S of V, since we know the viral shedding in that earlier period, we can then calculate for any value of viral shedding what the sensitivity would be. And then we get, so this is the infectiousness again, but then we can get this RT-PCR test sensitivity for what's back here using that interpolation function. So that's what we did, and it yields a pattern like this. And you can see that involves a very abrupt increase of the probability of a positive test over time. And that's been validated by a number of studies that have just been looking at, for instance, at health workers. There's been constant testing of health workers. And if a health worker gets ill, they often have day by day negative test, negative test, negative test, positive test. And then with the RT-PCR test, you even have these CT measures of how much viral load there is. And those studies have shown that the viral load just sort of skyrockets suddenly. So people go, from a morning test even to an evening test where they have a much, much, much higher CT level in RT-PCR. So it's a very abrupt shift. And I'll show you some data on that at the very end of the talk as well. Okay, so now we have the RT-PCR test sensitivity and we have the infectiousness. Then we do, this is my one methods slide really, and I'm not going to go through this in detail. I just want to say, this is where a lot of the early work that I did came in, was just trying to figure out how to actually calculate what the relative benefit of an RT-PCR tested quarantine of this long given start action at this time would be. And in particular, integrating over the uncertainty. So typically, we don't know when the person was infected. We're putting them into quarantine because we don't know if they are infected or not, right? And so the question is, how do we deal with the fact that they could have been infected at any time before there? And essentially, you can integrate, right? You can integrate over all the possible times they might have been infected. And that's what I'm doing here. You can see these are double integrals. One integral integrates over when they might have been infected, and the other integral integrates over the infectiousness curve during the time post-quarantine. And that gives you an estimate of how much infection will happen post-quarantine. So it's a nice analytical framework for doing this. I'd encourage anyone who's interested in trying to quantify infections after or before quarantine to dig into the supplementary methods of our approach. I think it's laid out very clearly, the math is, so it should be very easy to implement. And I think it provides a very nice quantitative way of actually characterizing that post-quarantine transmission for any application that someone has. And you just need a numerical solver for the double integrals to get the result, which isn't too hard. There's a lot of different results actually in the supplement, and I just put 3 here to give you an idea of a flavor for how they work. But essentially, you're integrating over this, call it the R of T for transmission over time. you have to deal with the symptomatic individuals and the asymptomatic individuals, which have different durations because we're assuming the symptomatic individuals do in fact self-isolate. And then that's if you're just going to do a test. If you're just doing a quarantine, this is what gives you the result when you have an unknown time of infection and you want another post-quarantine transmission. You can also add tests in, which just add this term here, which excludes those individuals who come in sick and are identified as sick based on the sensitivity at the time which we're integrating over here. Again, we have to integrate over the uncertainty of when they got infected to understand what the effectiveness of that test is. And you can do multiple tests by just having serial 1 minus SUs here or something like that. And we can take into account delays in the testing and the quarantine duration as well as when they got infected, so to speak. So all of that can be taken into account, and you can add, testing on entry and exit or multiple tests, however you want to quantify the effect of individuals getting tested. This is the result. And I'm just going to emphasize those two headline things that I mentioned already, but give you the data this time. So the greatest benefit of testing comes from testing on exit. So if you look at the top, you see based on the duration of quarantine, this is our prediction for how much you are reducing the risk of post-quarantine transmission. With a 14-day quarantine, it's down at about 0.025 for an individual who comes in who is infected, but where you don't know when they got infected. In other words, integrating over all possible times that they might have been infected. And so then that's the result there. If you do a test on entry, that is, you say, okay, well, let's test you when you come into quarantine to see if you're sick, because then we know to put you in case isolation. That can be extremely useful just for operational purposes. You let the person know they're sick. They understand that it's important for them to stay in case isolation. It can be important for operational procedures. Like in an industry, you've got to know, oh, we better put another worker into quarantine because this worker is going to be out for 2 weeks because of a positive result on COVID-19. There may be many reasons to test on entry, but I would just say that the one that it's not a very good reason is the reason to try to prevent post-quarantine transmission. It has a very moderate benefit on post-quarantine transmission. That's because anyone who is already sick enough that you detect them on entry probably will have most of their transmission gone by the time you exit from quarantine. It does depend a little bit on the duration of the quarantine, but typically that test on entry is not very useful. In contrast, a test on exit performed as close to the end of the quarantine as possible. And in this particular case, what we assumed was that it was 24 hours prior to the end of quarantine, has a very significant benefit, especially as you go on to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days. And adding the test on entry to that test on exit, again, has a marginal benefit. So really, most of the benefit is test on exit. And from this rule of thumb that you probably want to test as late as possible in quarantine as a rule of thumb. And that means what it means. So greatest benefit comes from testing on exit. Second point, as I mentioned earlier, compared to a 14-day quarantine with no testing, which is sort of what was out there as the criterion currently, you can see tracing this backward that in fact, a 6-day quarantine with a test on day 5 is about equivalent. A 7-day quarantine with a test on day 6 is probably better, and an 8-day with a test on day 7 would be great. And then you really start getting very diminishing returns for additional quarantine days. There are still returns, so you might as well do them if you can. But obviously, quarantine is often costly and undesirable. So the relative benefit is marginally diminishing as you go past 7 or 8 days. Now, that's not really true for if there's a no test situation. You're still gaining significant benefit from additional quarantine. But once you do the test around day 7, there is pretty marginal benefit to additional days of quarantine. All right, now I'm going to give you some of the sort of caveat-ish stuff. Remember those rules of thumb, they're basically good for you. But if you want to actually talk about what the optimal day to conduct the test is, as you might imagine, given what I've said before, if there's a 1-day delay, then you want to do it at day 0 because you have a 1-day delay and you have to get the test before you exit quarantine. If you do it on day 2, you have to do it on day 1 because of the 1-day delay, et cetera. 3, 4, 5, 6, up to day 7, that's exactly right. Now, actually, it turns out that once day 7 comes, the optimal time to do the test is actually on day 5 of the quarantine. And it stays there up till 30 days and then moves up to day 14. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about why it's this particular shape. It's not very important. The thing I want to emphasize is this is one of the issues of calculating optimal. This is truly the optimal, but the relative difference between doing the test on day 7 and day 8 and day 9, 10, up through 14, it's very, very marginal. There's very little difference. It's slightly better to do it a little bit earlier than it is to do it at exit. So because it's so slight, I think it's easier to do the public health messaging of just saying, do it as late as possible, and it probably will provide all the benefit that you need. Another way to say it, and maybe a more accurate way, would be to say do it on day 7 of the quarantine, and that's better sort of under all circumstances. If you really want to be optimal, you can look at this chart and figure out exactly when to do it. But the marginal differences there are very, very small. And the reason why it sort of goes down here is because the RT-PCR testing becomes a little less sensitive late in disease. But that turns out not to be terribly important, because late in disease, you have a transmission left to do. And so it doesn't really affect your post-quarantine transmission much at all. It just affects it barely enough so that you get an optimum. That doesn't continue going up in a line like this. Let me shift to the empirical results. So as I mentioned, this was really important to the oil and gas industry, who are dealing with this situation where they are very afraid that their platforms are going to get shut down because they don't have enough workers to operate on them, because they have to fly people off if there's a big outbreak on there. And by the way, this has happened. This is not a hypothetical situation. This has happened to quite a few oil industry rigs and platforms. When we started working with BHP, they were doing a certain regime, which was to do this test on entry idea, which was, if you look at, before any of our results or any other results on this came out, what people were doing was sometimes a test on entry. I'd say about 50%, some 50% of policymakers were saying, let's do a test on exit. It was kind of half and half. A lot of people were doing it on entry, and they were too, just because they figured then they could at least tell the person if they were sick, right? They were doing an only entry test and no real quarantine. And out of 820 people they sent off to the rig, 3 of them came out positive, and the rest went off onto the rig, and those 3 they put into isolation. Now, when we told them our results and said, hey, you should really try to do something along these lines, operationally, what they decided was possible for them was to put workers on a 5-day quarantine with a test at day 4. And the idea was then that they would test on entry and exit and see if they were going to catch anyone who came out positive after 96 hours, even though they got negative on day 1. And at this site, I have 2 sites here, A and B, there was relatively low prevalence during this time period of the disease, and 1 out of 112 came out positive on entry. That person was sent into isolation. But then out of those people who finished the quarantine, 1 out of 110 of those came out positive. So that was an indication that we need to be concerned about these individuals who are coming into quarantine, testing negative on entry, and yet proceeding through quarantine and about to get released, they may indeed be infected. This was a fairly small sample size because of the low prevalence. But at another site, which had a slightly different quarantine and testing regime, they actually had a 7-day quarantine, but also a test at 96 hours. They were looking, again, this is their original period before they changed things in response to some of the modeling we did. And what they said was that at entry, they had 19 individuals who ended up positive out of 892 they tested. But fortunately, 11 days later, they did some post-testing. In fact, during this entire period, I can tell you, they had no outbreaks on the rig. So it all worked out somewhat with some luck, and also with some happiness that they put this procedure in place, because after they put the procedure in place, the rates went up even higher. So at entry, they had about 30 individuals who turned out testing positive out of 998 tested. And at 96 hours of quarantine, 15 of those 916 ended up testing positive, and would have been, passed on to the rig using the old protocol, and could have led to an outbreak on the rig again, which would have been a massive issue to deal with. And if we calculate, we actually, just to see what that effect might have been, calculated how many individuals we expect might have gone on to cause an outbreak, given the number of tests here. And we estimated that about 9 individuals might have gone on to pass on their disease to other people. And so each one of those is a potential situation where you might have an out of control outbreak on these rigs. So I think we're very happy that this prevented this kind of thing from happening in those situations. But in general, this is a real warning point that says, you need to be concerned about doing the quarantine. You can't just do a test and fly kind of approach where you test them and say, okay, you're fine, you don't have disease. And moreover, it actually illustrates empirically that a 96-hour test does pretty well, because out of 155 tests they did 11 days, they were all negative. And also there were no outbreaks on the rigs. And so no one who was none of the people who were excluded by an entry and an exit at 96-hour test, in this case, a 7-day quarantine, actually went on to cause disease or outbreak on the rig. So it's a good sign that a 96-hour test is fairly effective at stopping individuals who are quarantined from passing on COVID-19 disease after a 7-day quarantine. That was really nice to get that data that reassured us that the modeling we'd done was accurate and doing a good job. And I just wanted to point out that there's a slightly different calculation because as I mentioned, that was all calculating on the sort of more difficult question, which is if we don't know when they were infected, what should the quarantine and testing regime be? If we actually know the exact date, then all of this becomes a lot easier. And I just want to give those results as well because they're actually slightly different. If you know when they were infected, then a very similar calculation, but a lot easier, there's only one integral instead of two, yields a specific optimal day to conduct the test. So let's just look at the 14-day quarantine because the others need to explain those, but they're useful just for reference. The x-axis here, if you look at the very bottom, is days post-infection entering quarantine. It isn't 5-day quarantine. It looks like that's the label of the x-axis here. This is how many days after the infection you enter the quarantine on the x-axis now. And so if you enter the quarantine 1 day after infection, you should do your test on day 6. If you enter the quarantine 2 days after you were infected, you should do it on day 5, etc. You'll notice that basically the number on the x-axis and the number on the y-axis add up to 7. So that's sort of the key number here. It's about a week. You want to do the test about a week after you were infected. Once you get to day 7, in terms of optimality, after day 7, you want to just stick with day 7. And this is with a 1-day delay in obtaining the test result. And so the question that might come to your mind immediately is, well, if I look across all these possible days that you're infected, most of the time, in fact, the best time to get the test is at day 0. So I heard you say earlier, Professor Townsend, that day 7 was the best day to do the test when you don't know it. Why does day 7 turn out to be the best day, or day? This is the day to conduct the test. So day 7 is here, where you do it on 6 for a 7-day test. So why is that better given all of this? You would think that it would be somewhere earlier because there's so many situations where earlier is optimal. And this is sort of the mistake one makes when one doesn't do all the calculations, because what the calculations tell you is that, in fact, almost all the risk with these unknown infections and a decent quarantine comes from people who were just infected before they entered the quarantine. So those are really kind of the only ones you have to worry about in some sense. And so it still is optimal to do the test later rather than earlier, because those are the ones you really want to prevent transmission from happening on. Whereas if you know the infection actually occurred on a certain day, you might be willing to adjust the optimum. Again, this is all about optimality versus effect. The main effect is that it's actually really good to do it on day 7, and doing it later tends to be quite good. It's just optimally you might shorten it if you knew exactly when the individual was infected. Okay, that's sort of the end of my major results section, but I do have a number of points I want to make with some slides here regarding the sensitivity of the results that I just gave you to the parameterization that we use. Because of course we had to parameterize this study, and there's a lot of excellent work being done in COVID-19, but it's being done very quickly. And so there are data sets out there that are published that are somewhat contradictory, arguing different things. And so there are some things that aren't as well known as we'd like. In my ideal world, I always try to do a full analysis of the kinds of results that we do. In this case, it wasn't really very possible because we basically needed to piece together the best results we could that made a logical story together. And there were data sets that actually literally contradict each other, where it was like one person would publish sensitivity data that doesn't fit with the infectivity curve, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's just impossible to make the timings work out right. So we did a lot of work trying to figure out what set made the most sense to us. And we were very happy with the set we came up with, but it meant that it wasn't as easy to do these kinds of sensitivity analyses as we would like. But we did do a number of piecewise one-way sensitivity analyses on different aspects. So for instance, overall transmission per infected case, these are just our assumptions. I'll talk about how we sensitivity analyze them in a moment, but we did specify it as R naught equals 2.5 for this, and that includes post-quarantine. So if you have measures in place post-quarantine to stop infection, it could be considerably lower. So the probabilities might be a lot lower. Secondly, the latent pre-symptomatic infectious period, that's that period I was trying to understand right before symptoms appear where you are infectious, was specified in our analysis as 2.9 days, which is pretty well justified by the literature, but there's definitely uncertainty around that. The test was parameterized again by the sensitivity RT-PCR testing, not other testing such as antigen testing. So if you want to use antigen testing, that is going to have some differences. And lastly, the sensitivity itself of the RT-PCR was assessed based on data on symptomatic cases from this paper by Miller et al. And then since then, there have been some results that have come up with some data that are not exactly contradictory, but are at least are quantitatively a little bit different from that Miller et al. Data. So I'll talk about all that. So first of all, let's just talk about R naught and the asymptomatic portion. If you change that R naught, what it does is if you increase it, then it moderately increases the post-quarantine transmission, but it doesn't really affect any of the optimality. So just looking at 2.0 and 2.5, and I'll tell you just from my experience, it doesn't really change it depending on what the R naught is, what the overall transmission rate is. So these new variants that are coming about, for instance, the optimality is the same, post-quarantine transmission risk is higher, so you may want to extend quarantines longer in that case. You also might want to extend quarantines longer when the prevalence is higher, right? I haven't even really talked about that here, but of course, you know, your risk is higher when the prevalence is higher, when you have more individuals who are going through quarantine who are infected. So both of those need to be taken into account, but the optimality of the timing, et cetera, doesn't change based on R naught or prevalence. And also, if you change the asymptomatic proportion, that does sort of change the shape of this curve a little bit. So these four curves are just changing R naught and the asymptomatic proportion, but it doesn't really affect the overall shape in a big way. And it doesn't, and I'll just assure you that it doesn't make a difference to the optimality results that we got. And you still, even in the best situation, which is low asymptomaticity and a low R naught, you still have the situation where silent spread is the major issue with COVID-19. All right, what if we modify that latent period? Ignore these numbers in the middle here. The numbers that are important are over here. The 2.9 day latent period is this black line. That's what I've been showing you. If you change it so it's a shorter latent period, 1.9 days, then you get this green dot dash line. And if you make it a longer one, you get this blue one. And so those curves do affect the shape, but they don't end up affecting the optimality either. You still end up with this central period where it's really important, where you have high RTR sensitivity and high infectiousness, a pretty steep curve on the left and a slow curve on the right. So it doesn't really change things dramatically. It does have a little bit of effect on the sensitivity curve that we're inferring back here, because remember, we're using that infectivity curve to understand the sensitivity. So it turns out that the sensitivity is a little bit later if you have a longer latent period, but overall, these numbers work out okay. And again, the optimality that we've calculated, those rules of thumb don't change at all. And the curves look quite largely the same as that set of curves I showed you earlier. Now, let me talk a little bit about antigen tests. There are lots of different tests for COVID-19. The two that have really manifested as being useful in terms of not just serology, but in terms of like stopping the epidemic are the RT-PCR test, which everyone is now familiar with, and these antigen tests, which came out fairly recently and have been improving in their ability to actually specifically and sensitively detect COVID-19. This is just from last year, which actually doesn't even talk about the antigen tests because it was before they came out. There were antibody tests and there were PCR tests and a number of other tests. And the point here is just that each test has a different sensitivity over time. And so since sensitivity over time is a critical aspect of quarantine and testing, you know, our results for RT-PCR really need to be executed with a different sensitivity profile to understand what their consequences are for COVID-19 transmission in quarantine and testing. So for instance, if we look at the agreement of a rapid antigen test, this is the BD Veritor test, which is probably, it was one of the first ones to come out and has the least sensitivity, or is probably the worst one there is out there. So it sort of bounds what we might see, but it's also the most commonly available one because they came out with it quickly and manufactured more. And it has a diminishing sensitivity over time from infection. And this is the curve, and this is the uncertainty. So taking into account that curve uncertainty with regard to what the sensitivity of the BD Veritor rapid antigen test is important for understanding disease transmission in the quarantine and testing scenario. And in particular, this curve that we used for our analysis of quarantine and testing, if you then take those BD results and execute the same operation as I mentioned before on it, you get this reflection of its sensitivity over time. And as you can see, it's largely a similar shape with just the more restricted domain of utility and a slightly lower ability to detect. Consequently, largely the optimality rules stay the same, but again, post-quarantine transmission increases to a pretty significant degree with the BD Veritor test. You might think it's largely because of this difference. I think that difference has a small effect. The big difference is this difference right here. You're not going to detect someone with the antigen maybe 2 days later than you would detect it with the RT-PCR, and that really corresponds to a potential considerable amount of transmission. So you have to be a bit wary of the fact that BD Veritor is not such a great way of catching people before they transmit, although you can catch people sort of when they're about in the middle of when they're going to be transmitting. We've actually done this on a number of different tests. As I mentioned, a lot of the other ones that came out later are slightly better, but they're also less available. And they're approaching the ability of the RT-PCR test in sensitivity. Most of this is with the manufacturer data on its sensitivity. And so, take it with a grain of salt. They may not be as good as that. The BD Veritor is actually done with independent peer-reviewed data on BD Veritor. So, I'm not sure if these curves are exactly right, but that's data that's provided by manufacturers would say with regard to the relative utility compared to the RT-PCR test. Now I want to go back to this last point, which is the RT-PCR test itself. Our estimate of that sensitivity is really critical to how useful that RT-PCR test is. And recently a paper came out, it's on bioRxiv, so it's still a preprint, it's not peer-reviewed, so I don't want to hang my hat on it, but I do just want to mention that there is data out there from Hellawell et al. And what they did is they looked at asymptomatic individuals who are in the healthcare workforce, asymptomatic individuals in the healthcare workforce, and estimated the efficacy of the PCR test in detecting infection. And because they did it serially day after day, they got estimates both for post-infection, but also for pre-symptom appearance. And that's really valuable because it characterizes that region that I talked about that we had to do that math trick of flipping it over and using the interpolation function for. And that allows us to fit a hill to this sensitivity of the RT-PCR test over days. And you can see, I guess the one thing that I'm very happy about is that, in fact, that math trick we did worked. And in fact, it is a very steep increase from, say, 2 days back to up to 1 day before symptom onset or so. And so that's reassuring. This curve is actually, overall quite similar to the curve that we had, although it is a lower curve. So if you look at the maximum, it maxes out at about 0.8. And so if we just compare the two together, you see it looks something like this. So again, it may be that RT-PCR is slightly less beneficial than we would hoped, especially for asymptomatic individuals, which is a minor proportion of the population, but an important part of the population for quarantine and testing to functionally prevent post-quarantine transmission. Therefore, maybe we should take results with a little bit more caution with regard to the testing side. And I would just argue that, you probably want to use it, one step better than what was in our original plot. So for instance, we can see that for a 14-day quarantine on day 6, it's about equivalent to do a 6-day quarantine with the test on day 5. I'd say go ahead and do the 7-day quarantine on a day 5 because that distinction in the RT-PCR test means it may not be quite as good. And I think you'll recoup most of that benefit with a 7-day calculation. And that's a calculation we can do. And I think we will as soon as we get that Hellawell data out of bioRxiv and into a publication where we can start trusting it and cite it in work that we're doing. But overall, I was pretty happy with the fact that their curves were reasonably shaped the same way as ours. And I'm not sure why there's a discrepancy between the Hellawell data and the Hay et al. Data, and not Hay et al. Data that we use for RT-PCR sensitivity. I would just comment that the Miller data was symptomatic, so maybe it's just a difference in viral loads between the two. So probably the reality for a generic quarantine and testing lies 3/4 of the way from this black curve from Hellawell to this red curve from Miller et al. Because 3/4 of the just as a linear interpolation, being that 3/4 of individuals are symptomatic and another quarter of them are asymptomatic. So, so somewhere between these two is probably what one should ideally use for the situation. So again, I think a marginal improvement on the basis of what we originally said in terms of like being a little more skeptical of the benefit of the test should make up for any difference, if there is a difference in the sensitivity from what Miller et al. Published in their peer-reviewed paper. Okay, so I've showed you those results. I'm just going to come back to the conclusions, which I think I've I've said many times, so I probably don't need to say them verbally again. Late tests, we can provide an equivalency between 7 days and a 14-day quarantine if you get a negative result at 1 week. Thanks very much for your time, and I would be overjoyed to entertain any questions anyone has.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Excellent talk. I have questions, but I'm going to go to moderate the session, and I'll ask when my turn comes.
Okay.
This is an excellent talk. I mean, I followed your literature like from my archive, so like I think it was very influential in increasing compliance. Maybe at least in my local circles, when I was recommending people to quarantine, I was suggesting that based on some of these literature. So one thing that I've at least noticed is like how sensitive it is to the delays that you see. Like you showed some result based on one day delay between testing and result. So how far out are they still useful? Like for instance, if you have like a 3-day delay versus 5-day delay. So at what point does it go back to like just do a 10-day, 14-day version?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, somehow I never thought about it in that dimension. I mean, we just kept on using that 1-day delay and we never assessed that directly. Obviously that's, a trivial additional calculation on what we did, but we never made a chart relaying that. And I actually, just in you saying it right now, I realized that that's certainly an operational question people must confront. If they're stuck in the situation where they know, like, look, the typical delay is 48 hours or 72 hours even for a test result, what is my optimal thing that I should do? I guess what I would kind of recommend to do with the charts and tables that we have provided is think about it in terms of saying, well, let me go back and share the slide, and this is, not the ideal answer that I could give you, but I can at least sort of narrate you how I think one should think through it. Here we go. The way I would think about that to get some idea of intuitively what you should do is to look at this, look at it like I would go with a duration of quarantine that corresponds to the test. So obviously, if you have a 3-day delay and you're thinking of doing a 6-day quarantine, just think about it as that would be a 4-day quarantine, which you are doing, but you're adding 2 days on it, right? So if you think of that as a 4-day quarantine, this would be the estimate of how much you are likely to have a post-quarantine transmission. And then but then you're like, well, what's the additional advantage of the additional 2 days on this that I'm going to get, right? So if it was a 3-day delay, you go back to day 4, because that's the day 4 was calculated with a 24-hour day. You say, this is my benefit here, but I'm going to go 2 more days without a test. What's the benefit of that? Well, then you can sort of just interpolate based on what the benefit of a no test from here to here is. So if you just sort of take that graph and look at what it does, that's probably going to tell you what the result would be. So you can sort of, graphically.
I think, this graph was very revealing in terms of what the trade-offs are, like in terms of testing on entry versus just no testing. Because at some point, I think the trade-off, at least having spoken to like 2 or 3 folks who were going through the same decision process when they were either traveling on entry or they had just done a domestic travel, they were always asking like, I've gotten to 5 days. Should I test now because it will come back only 4 days later? Does it even matter? And again, like, they were trading off some of these sensitivity curves that you showed across different tests. So they were saying like, if I go to severe, I'll get like something that's rapid, but like may not be as sensitive, and I don't know what to do. And at that point, they just decide after 2 days, I'll go with no testing. So, and I think some of these really help make the argument of like when, depending upon what test you use at what time, it's most useful. Yeah. So thanks a lot for this. Yeah.
Great. So I hope that's useful if anyone is in that situation with a slightly longer delay. You can sort of just combine the curve from here and the curve from here to make it up. And I think will be approximately the right answer. Another question?
I think I saw Andrew next.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I just wanted to ask if your analysis had any bearing, or your existing analysis, or if you thought about doing analysis relative to the at-home antigen tests, and how that might shift the sort of the criteria for evaluation given like potential ubiquity of testing.
Yeah, so sorry, I brought that up, like I set that up like I was going to say an answer to that, and then I didn't give you the answer. We haven't calculated it for that yet, unfortunately, so I don't have a plot I can show you. But generally speaking, the antigen tests, they are less sensitive according to that diagram that I did show. So we've got all the pieces in place to calculate that. And in general, what I would say is that, they're not as good as the PCR test, and so you could draw a line in sort of between these two, right? And how far in between is the issue that we would like to really quantify. But I would argue that it's somewhere around like a little better than halfway between these two, if you do an antigen test. So because it doesn't do you quite as much good, because it's not going to catch you as early in disease, et cetera, but it definitely does some good. And we've done some analyses along these lines. We just don't have this particular plot for this. So there's some reason for, I'm not just making this up. I have some, it's going to be somewhere around there pretty surely. That's kind of a midway kind of answer. It neither says yes nor no, but it's definitely true that the antigen test is not going to be as good as that PCR test. Or at least, maybe some of them are, because some of those manufacturer reported results were pretty astonishingly good compared to PCR, but I don't entirely manufacturer reported results. Those are in such ideal circumstances. So it's kind of a middling answer for you, but I would say, don't assume an antigen test is as good as RT-PCR, but it definitely is going to have a beneficial effect. And if you're asking for a seat of the pants answer, I'd say if you can go up to like 8 or 9 days and do a test on exit, I think then the antigen test will, an antigen test at 8 or 9 days, if you don't want to go for a whole PCR test, should do you pretty well in that situation. If you want to be consistent with the CDC, they say do this 10-day one without any test. I certainly think if you do an antigen test at the end of 10 days, that's probably as good as a 14-day with no test, and maybe even better.
Right. So I just also something that I was considering in this question was like, in terms of the availability of paper strip tests, if a copy number might have a bearing on your analysis, in terms of cheap, widely available at home regimes that you can test yourself multiple times with, potentially less efficacy.
Yeah. So one of the things that we did not study throughout all this, I guess a caveat, is like, one of the reasons I wanted to stick with exit and entry is that there may be a lot of autocorrelation, or there may not be. I don't know exactly. And we are studying some data on this now, but I don't have any results on it, between whether you get a positive test on one day and whether you get a positive test on another day. In other words, is it just stochastically getting, obviously, maybe you could just do multiple RT-PCR tests on one day and maybe that would be better. But most people would say that's probably not, because it's probably a high autocorrelation. That's one of the things that we don't really know the answer to. And so for that reason, I hesitate to say any answer about whether multiple tests would be beneficial or not. It certainly won't hurt.
Sure.
So go ahead kind of is the answer. But I don't know what the criteria for that would be. And it depends on the particular test, what its sensitivity is. And if manufacturer has results, then they can be put into this framework to figure out what the sensitivity is. And certainly, and my point to finish my thought that I started earlier is that entry and exit are far enough apart that any autocorrelation hopefully is gone. And so then our results should hold pretty well.
Got it. Thank you.
Next question from Galen Harrison.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the great talk. I'm curious. So like optimal testing date with a known date of infection. I'm wondering if you have any intuition about whether it would change, and to what degree it would change if, instead of knowledge about when exactly the infection took place, you have maybe some kind of uncertainty about it, or like you have some distribution, like probability distribution of sort of like likelihood of exposure of exposure or infection over a certain restricted period or something like that.
So my intuition is like giving you the rule of thumb answer. Testing around 7 days after you got infected is probably the best thing. So I think that it's true that whatever your uncertainty there is, if you want to be conservative, take the end date and go 7 days afterwards. And if you want to be, not conservative, go with the estimate, the central estimate, and go 7 days afterwards, are sort of what the operational decision making, I would say, on the basis of what I've done. On a more methodological standpoint, any uncertainty distribution you have for that infection date could just be put into those double integrals I mentioned with no problem. So that outer integral just integrate over that uncertainty, because the way we were doing it, we're integrating uniformly over the disease time course during that period. So if you know that that the individual was infected, somewhere in these 3 days, and you could even have any description functionally of what that is, you would just want to integrate over that particular function of the uncertainty to do this calculation, and the math would work out fine. And so it wouldn't be hard to do that. We haven't done it, but you could just dig in. You can dig into our formulas in the back, and it would be not. Getting all the data in would be hard. Like, I'm not trying to make it sound like a trivial operation to do this, but in terms of the calculation itself, it's straightforward with the math that we've provided, the theory we've provided.
Okay, we're just a couple minutes over time. So Manav, would you like to take the last question?
Sure, I'll be brief, Jeff, and I can talk to you later. I just want to let you know that we've been working with our State Department of Health here, and CDC guidance came in our discussion. I was not aware that your work had played a role in it. But one of the questions that we've been studying and is useful is to see the downstream effect if there's an error in picking this up. So we are actually looking at, if you do it at 7 days, 10 days, 14 days, what might happen to the overall infection. And we can use our agent-based models to say, what the chances were in terms of the errors. So it doesn't tell you what exactly happens to that person, but it tells you intuitively that if you are a super spreader effectively, then intuitively going back with an erroneous test is a costly affair. And that can be picked up by the simulations. We know it's hard to estimate any other way. But we can talk about it later. I just thought I'd let you know, but I found this very interesting.
Yeah, so that it's a very good point. There's two things that you say that I just want to comment on very briefly. One is that like the agent-based modeling that you're doing is going to be especially effective when you have a real idea of post-quarantine, what the environment there is going to be like, what the agents are going to be doing, et cetera, because then you can model that very explicitly. Of course, we left that completely inexplicit in everything that we did. We just said, oh, well, the person comes out and they've got this much transmission left, and there's this much of an R naught, and then how much do they transmit? Like, it has nothing, there's nothing about, in what we've done, the actual environment they exit the quarantine into for making that prediction. So that's where that modeling, I think, will be critical. And furthermore, I would just, the only thing I want to say that we did take into account is we did, fortunate that while I was doing this modeling, Sam Scarpino came and gave a talk at Yale about his work, and he's working all on the clustering and network analysis, and showing that, like, look, COVID-19 is sort of intermediate in super spreading between SARS-1 and influenza. Influenza has very little super spreading, and this is somewhere in the middle. Anyway, so he came and gave that talk, which was fantastic, because I just sat there and wrote down the numbers from the slides that he gave that I needed in this model. So the one thing we did do was we did lower the probability of post-quarantine transmission, as it should be, on the basis of super spreading, which generally means that if we just said, oh, R naught is 2.5 and used a Poisson distribution, we would have gotten a higher post-quarantine transmission than is shown on the slide that I'm still sharing. But in fact, it is true that it is clustered, and some people tend to spread quite a lot, and then others don't spread at all. And so for that reason, I was glad that we incorporated that, because for the application of whether you're not going to infect your relatives, or the application of whether you're going to cause an outbreak on the rig, that is actually highly relevant. Of course, it sounds like, oh, it's just better if things are clustered. It's not just better if things are clustered, because it reduces the post-quarantine transmission probability. But when you do get that outbreak, it means the outbreak is much bigger, and so much more problematic. So it just emphasizes how important it is to stop that outbreak at the get-go with appropriate quarantine and testing strategies.
Right. Great. Thanks. Yeah, that's very useful, Jeff. Appreciate this talk.
Great. So I'm really pleased to have been able to give it, and thank you for your outstanding questions.
Great.
Thank you, Jeff, for your talk today. Just want to tell everyone that Aaron has put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. So you can find all of our previous seminars on that channel, as well as Jeff's talk will be posted in a couple of days. And thanks everybody for coming. Our next seminar will be in 2 weeks on February 11th. We'll have Wilfred and Defon from the AIMS Global Network. So I hope everyone can attend then as well.
One quick note, I just want to remind everyone to please cite the grant whenever you remember, because I think it's really important that we acknowledge the support NSF has given us to the extent you have used these funds to do it, of course. It, of course, is very helpful when you write a report. And believe it or not, we're coming to the close to the end of first year. We got our first official notice from NSF that the reports will be due in 3 months. So I can't imagine, but we are there. So that will help a lot as we prepare our reports. So thank you very much. Thanks, Golda. Thanks, Jeff. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks.